You know the Wendigo from movies, from video games. A tall skeletal creature with antlers and glowing eyes. A monster that hunts in winter forests. Scary, sure, but safe. Contained within stories. That version. That's the version we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night. Because the real Wendigo, the actual origin of what happens when that transformation begins, it's not a creature you encounter in the woods. It's what you become. And the process, the slow descent from human to something else, that's where the true horror lives. This is a story about hunger. Not the kind you feel when you skip lunch, the kind that hollows you out, the kind that replaces everything you are with one single screaming need. And once it starts, there's no going back. What you're about to hear is not a documentary. It's a story, a terrifying reimagining of something far older and darker than pop culture legends. And if you listen closely, you might recognize the symptoms. His name was Thomas Whitmore Trapper. 32 years old, he'd spent 7 winters in the northern Canadian wilderness, and he knew the rules. Never venture out alone during a blizzard. Always keep 3 weeks of supplies. And most importantly, never, ever stay isolated for more than 2 months at a time. That winter, he broke all 3 rules. The cabin sat in a valley so remote that even the indigenous Cree people avoided it. They had a name for that place, though Thomas never learned it. A name that translated roughly to where the hunger sleeps. But Thomas didn't speak Cree, and he didn't listen to warnings. The first week was normal. He checked his trap lines, caught rabbits, a few foxes, salted the meat, hung it to dry. The work was mechanical, familiar, comforting even. The silence of snow falling on pine branches, the crack of ice on the frozen lake. These were sounds he understood. But by the second week, something changed. It started with the cold. Thomas had endured brutal winters before, temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero. But this cold was different. It didn't come from outside. It radiated from within his own chest, spreading through his veins like frozen water. No amount of firewood could touch it. And then came the hunger. At first, Thomas thought he'd simply underestimated his food supplies. He ate his usual portions, then double, then triple. But the gnawing in his stomach only intensified. It wasn't normal hunger. It felt ancient, primal, like something waking up after sleeping for 1,000 years. He devoured an entire smoked rabbit in one sitting, felt nothing but emptiness. He ate until his stomach distended, until he should have been sick. But the hunger remained sharp, demanding, growing stronger with each meal. Maybe the meat's gone bad, he told himself, checking his stores, but everything was fine, properly preserved. The problem wasn't the food. The problem was him. By week 3, Thomas began noticing other changes. His reflection in the small mirror above his wash basin looked wrong. His eyes seemed darker, not the color, but something behind them, as if the person looking back wasn't entirely him anymore. His senses sharpened to an unnatural degree. He could hear a mouse moving beneath 3 feet of snow, could smell blood from an injured deer 2 miles away. And that smell, God, that smell, it made his mouth water in a way that terrified him. The thoughts started soon after. Not his thoughts, he was certain of that. They came from somewhere else, somewhere deep and cold and eternally hungry. They whispered about meat, fresh meat, warm meat. They showed him images of things he'd never considered before, things that made him sick with revulsion and something worse, and then desire. Thomas tried to fight it, he really did. He rationed his food more carefully, thinking maybe he was eating too much, too fast. He forced himself to eat slowly, to savor each bite, to remind himself of what it meant to be human, civilized, in control. First, it didn't help. The hunger grew teeth. It clawed at his insides with a ferocity that left him doubled over, gasping. And with it came the physical changes he could no longer ignore. His body temperature dropped. When he touched his own skin, it felt like touching a corpse. Yet he didn't feel cold anymore. The internal chill had become normal. Room temperature felt hot. The fire felt like standing next to the sun. He grew taller, impossibly taller. His clothes no longer fit right. The doorway he'd walked through 1,000 times now required him to duck. His spine elongated, vertebrae cracking and reforming in ways that should have been agonizing but felt natural. His teeth changed too, sharpened. When he ran his tongue over them, he tasted blood from where the new points cut his own mouth, and he liked the taste. That's when Thomas understood. This wasn't sickness, this wasn't starvation or madness or cabin fever. This was transformation. He'd heard the stories. Every trapper in the North had tales told around campfires, dismissed as superstition by men who thought themselves too practical, too modern for such nonsense. Stories about people who went into the wilderness and came back, changed, if they came back at all. The Algonquian peoples had a name for it, Wendigo, a spirit of endless hunger, a curse that turned humans into monsters, a punishment for the ultimate taboo. But Thomas hadn't eaten human flesh. He'd been careful, moral, civilized, so why was this happening to him? The answer came during his 4th week alone, and it was so much worse than he'd imagined. Here's what Thomas didn't understand about the Wendigo curse, what nobody who hasn't experienced it could possibly understand. It's not about what you eat, it's about what you hunger for. The Wendigo isn't created by the act of cannibalism. That's the folktale version, the simple explanation, the one that makes sense to human logic. The truth is older, more insidious. The Wendigo is born from a specific kind of desperation, a hunger so profound, so all-consuming, that it rewrites your very nature. It could be hunger for food, yes, but it could also be hunger for power, for control, for survival at any cost. The Wendigo feeds on that moment when a human being crosses an internal line they can never uncross, when they choose their own survival over their own humanity. And Thomas had crossed that line weeks ago. He just hadn't realized it yet. It happened during a blizzard. 3 days of whiteout conditions. He'd been checking his trap lines when the storm hit, sudden and vicious. Should have turned back immediately. Should have followed protocol. But one of his traps had caught something. He could smell it, and the hunger wouldn't let him leave it. He pushed forward into the storm, lost the trail back to his cabin, wandered for hours in the screaming wind and blinding snow. His rational mind knew he was going to die. Hypothermia, exposure, a stupid preventable death. But that other voice, the cold ancient voice, it said, survive at any cost, do anything, become anything. And in that moment, Thomas Whitmore made a choice. He accepted that voice, welcomed it, let it guide him back to the trapped animal. When he found it, a young doe still alive, one leg shattered in his steel trap, he didn't think about mercy, about ending its suffering quickly. He thought about the hunger. He ate it while it was still warm, still breathing, and he felt nothing but satisfaction. That was the moment. Not when he consumed the flesh, but when he stopped feeling human while doing it. The Wendigo had found him. Week 5 brought the first snow of blood. That's what Thomas called it later in the fragments of memory that remained. He woke up one morning, and the snow around his cabin had turned crimson. Not splattered, not stained. The entire clearing, a perfect circle about 50 feet in diameter, had snow the color of fresh blood. But when he touched it, pure white, cold normal. The blood was only visible from inside the cabin, looking out as if the world itself was warning him, showing him what he'd become. His reflection in the mirror no longer looked human. Oh, the shape was still there, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, joints that bent in directions they shouldn't. And his face. He couldn't bring himself to look at his face for more than a few seconds. The hunger reached a crescendo that night. It wasn't physical anymore. It had transcended his body and become something metaphysical. A need so overwhelming it felt like gravity, pulling him towards something inevitable. Thomas tried to resist. He locked himself in the cabin, tied himself to his bed frame with leather straps, prayed to a god he hadn't spoken to since childhood. But you can't pray away a transformation that's already complete. Around midnight, the straps broke. Not because he struggled against them, they simply dissolved, rotted away in seconds, as if they'd been buried in the ground for decades. Thomas stood, walked to the door, opened it. The forest waited, and deep in that forest, he could smell them. 3 trappers camped 6 miles north. He could hear their heartbeats, could taste their fear on the wind, even though they didn't know yet they had reason to be afraid. The human part of Thomas screamed, begged, tried to turn back, but the tenderness seemed disser, or she with the hunger. The hunger was in control now. When Thomas Whitmore woke up 3 days later, he was 12 miles from his cabin, naked, covered in frost that had frozen to his skin like armor. His hands were stained with something dark. His mouth tasted of copper. And the hunger was finally quiet. For about 6 hours. Then it came back stronger, sharper, more demanding. Because that's the true curse of the Wendigo, the true horror that the legends don't capture. It's not that you become a monster, it's that you remain conscious, aware, a passenger in your own body, watching as it does things that would have made you vomit just weeks before. And the worst part? A small part of you enjoys it. The transformation doesn't erase who you were. It adds something on top, something older and colder, and infinitely more patient. You're still in there screaming, but you're sharing the space now. And with each feeding, the hunger returns faster, stronger, more demanding. Thomas fed again 4 days later, then 2 days after that, then daily, then twice daily. The curse doesn't just change your body. It rewrites your needs, transforms the very concept of satisfaction into a cruel joke. Because a Wendigo can never be full. The hunger is the point. The hunger is eternal. And here's the thing that kept Thomas awake during those brief moments when the hunger receded enough for him to think clearly. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The forest was full of them. He could sense them now, other Wendigos scattered across the northern wilderness. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. All of them were once human. All of them made the same choice he did. All of them were trapped in the same endless cycle. And in the deepest winter, when the temperature dropped low enough and the isolation became complete enough, new ones were always being born. But the physical transformation, that was just the beginning. The real horror was what happened to the mind, to the soul. Because the Wendigo doesn't just take your body, it takes something much worse, something that can never be returned. And once you understand what that is, you'll never look at hunger the same way again. Thomas Whitmore vanished in the winter of 1893. His cabin was found the following spring by a group of Cree hunters. The door was open. The interior was destroyed. Claw marks gouged deep into the wooden walls, and in the center of the room, frozen in a pool of something dark, his clothes, shredded, empty. No body was ever recovered. But here's what the official reports didn't mention. What the hunters saw but never spoke about to outsiders. The tracks leading away from the cabin. Footprints that started human-sized at the door and grew larger with each step. By the time they reached the tree line, they were nearly 3 feet long, with too many joints in the toes. The hunters burned the cabin, performed rituals, left offerings, and they never ever returned to that valley. Because they understood something that Thomas had learned too late. The Wendigo transformation isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of something much worse. Here's what nobody tells you about becoming a monster, what the legends conveniently leave out. You don't lose yourself. That would be merciful. That would be a release if the transformation erased your memories, your personality, your sense of self. You could call it death, an ending. But the Wendigo curse is specifically designed to prevent that mercy. You remain aware, fully conscious every moment of every day. You watch through eyes that are still yours as your body commits atrocities. You feel the satisfaction of the feeding, even as your human mind recoils in horror. You experience the pleasure of the hunt, even as what remains of your soul screams in protest. It's a prison. Your own body becomes your cell, and the sentence is eternal. Thomas discovered this during his second month as a Wendigo. There was a moment, brief and crystalline, where the hunger receded enough for him to think clearly, to remember who he'd been, to understand what he'd become. He tried to kill himself, walked into the middle of a frozen lake, broke through the ice, let the water pull him down into darkness. His lungs filled, his heart stopped, everything went black. And then 3 hours later, he woke up on the shore, perfectly preserved, perfectly alive, the hunger roaring back with renewed intensity. Because here's the terrible truth about Wendigos: they can't die, not easily, not by any normal means. Fire might slow them down, extreme trauma might incapacitate them temporarily, but true death, that requires something most people don't have access to, something most people don't even know exists. And in the meantime, the hunger never stops, but it gets worse. During his third month, Thomas began to sense them, the others. At first, it was just vague awareness, a feeling of not being alone even when the forest stretched empty for miles in every direction, like someone watching from just beyond his peripheral vision. And then the dream started. He saw through other eyes, experienced other hunts, felt other transformations happening in real time. A logger in Minnesota succumbing during a particularly brutal winter, a prospector in Alaska isolated for too long in his claim, a researcher at an Antarctic station driven to madness by endless darkness. The Wendigo curse creates a network, a hive mind of hunger spanning the coldest, most isolated places on Earth. Every Wendigo is connected to every other Wendigo. They share sensations, memories, the accumulated experience of thousands of transformations across centuries. And Thomas realized something that froze what remained of his human heart. This wasn't random. This wasn't natural selection or supernatural bad luck. The Wendigo curse was intelligent, purposeful. It had goals. It was spreading. Each new Wendigo added to the network. Each transformation made the next one easier. The collective hunger grew stronger, reaching out across vast distances to find new hosts, new people in new situations of desperation and isolation. Thomas could feel them all now, the old ones centuries old, barely remembering their human names, the young ones still fighting, still hoping for escape, and the ones in between, the ones who'd accepted, who'd embraced the hunger, who'd stopped seeing it as a curse and started seeing it as evolution. Those were the most terrifying. The network showed Thomas things, memories that weren't his own. He saw a French fur trader in 1647, the first documented European transformation. The man had been warned by local tribes, had dismissed their concerns as primitive superstition, had ventured alone into Hudson Bay during the harshest winter in recorded history. The transformation took 3 weeks. By the end, 14 people from his trading post had disappeared. The survivors spoke of a creature that moved faster than human eyes could follow, that could mimic human voices perfectly, that seemed to know their thoughts before they did. Thomas saw a group of settlers in 1823, an entire family. They'd been snowed in for 4 months. Food ran out. Then choices were made, terrible choices. And by spring, there were no settlers, only Wendigos, 5 of them, moving through the forest in perfect synchronization, a pack. He saw soldiers during World War I, stationed at a remote outpost in northern Russia. The combination of war trauma, extreme cold, and complete isolation created perfect conditions. 7 men transformed over the course of a single week. They killed their entire regiment. 63 soldiers gone. The official report blamed enemy action, but the few survivors knew better. They just couldn't speak the truth without sounding insane. The pattern was always the same: isolation, extreme cold, desperate hunger, physical or metaphorical, and a choice, always a choice. The moment when survival instinct overrode humanity, that's when the curse could take hold. And with each generation, it was getting easier. The threshold was lowering. What once required months of isolation now took weeks. What once required actual starvation now required only profound desperation. The Wendigo curse was adapting, learning, evolving, and Thomas understood why. Here's what Thomas learned from the network, what all Wendigos eventually discover. They're not just monsters. They're not even really supernatural entities, not in the traditional sense. They're something older, something that existed before humans had words for it, a manifestation of hunger itself. Not hunger for food, hunger as a concept, as a force of nature. The universe tends toward entropy, toward consumption, toward the transformation of complex things into simpler things. Stars collapse, civilizations fall. Everything eventually gets devoured by something. The Wendigo is that principle given form, given consciousness, given teeth. And here's the truly horrifying part. It's not evil, not in any moral sense. It doesn't hate. It doesn't take pleasure in suffering. It simply hungers, and hunger doesn't have ethics. A lion isn't evil for eating a gazelle. A black hole isn't malicious for consuming stars, and a Wendigo isn't wicked for feeding on humans. It's just doing what it was designed to do, what it has always done, what it will always do. The curse transforms humans because humans are perfect hosts. We're intelligent enough to hunt efficiently, social enough to spread the curse, and riddled with enough psychological weakness that we can be turned under the right conditions. Every Wendigo was once a person who believed they were strong, who thought they could handle isolation, who trusted their own humanity. And every single one was wrong. Now let me tell you something that should keep you awake tonight. The Wendigo curse didn't end in the 1800s. It didn't fade with industrialization. It didn't disappear when we mapped every corner of the wilderness. It adapted. Thomas Whitmore was one of the last traditional Wendigos, the kind created by physical isolation in actual wilderness. But as the 20th century progressed, the curse found new vectors, new forms of isolation, new kinds of hunger. Urban isolation, the kind where you can be surrounded by millions of people and still be completely alone, where you can go weeks without a meaningful human connection, where hunger isn't for food but for purpose, for validation, for connection. Digital isolation, the kind where you interact with thousands of people online but never really touch another human being, where your life becomes performance, where you're simultaneously hyper-connected and profoundly disconnected. These don't create traditional Wendigos. No antlers, no elongated limbs, no physical transformation visible to the naked eye. But the hunger is the same, the loss of humanity is the same, the endless gnawing need that can never be satisfied, that's identical. And here's what the network showed Thomas before his human consciousness finally dissolved completely. There are more Wendigos now than at any point in human history. Most of them don't even know what they are. They walk among us. They look human, they function in society, but inside they're hollow, consumed by hunger they can't name, driven by needs they can't articulate, slowly, inexorably, losing the parts of themselves that made them human. You want to know how to spot them? How to know if someone you love is transforming? It starts small, always small. They stop caring about things that used to matter. Not dramatically, just the light goes out of their eyes when they talk about their passions. The enthusiasm becomes performance. They isolate, make excuses not to see people. Not because they're depressed exactly, because being around humans feels off, wrong, like a wolf trying to live among sheep. They develop strange eating patterns. Not eating disorders in the clinical sense, but their relationship with consumption changes. Sometimes they binge, sometimes they fast for days, and it's never really about the food, it's about control, about filling a void that can't be filled. Their empathy dims, not all at once, but you notice they don't react quite right anymore. Someone shares good news, and their congratulations sound hollow. Someone shares pain, and their sympathy feels mechanical. And their eyes, if you look closely at their eyes when they think no one's watching, there's something cold there, something ancient and patient, and eternally hungry. These are the warning signs, the early stages. Most people never complete the transformation. They hover in that in-between state, human enough to function, hungry enough to suffer, too far gone to go back, not far enough gone to disappear completely. But some cross that final threshold, and when they do, let me tell you what happened to Thomas. His human consciousness lasted almost 2 years. Longer than most, he fought harder than most, held on to his memories, his name, his sense of self with desperate ferocity. But the hunger is patient and it never stops. Gradually, his human thoughts became whispers, then echoes, then just static in the background of an endless roaring need. By the winter of 1895, there was no more Thomas, just the thing wearing his shape, still technically alive, still conscious in some fundamental way, but no longer human in any meaningful sense. He wandered the northern wilderness for decades. Hunters sometimes reported sightings, a creature that moved between the trees like smoke, too tall, too thin, eyes that reflected light like a wolf's, but the wrong color, the wrong shape. The last confirmed sighting was in 1963. A group of researchers studying wildlife migration. They found tracks, fresh ones, leading from an abandoned mine shaft in northern Manitoba. The tracks were massive, and they showed signs of extreme age, joints that had fused wrong, bones that had grown and regrown hundreds of times. A creature that should have died long ago, but simply couldn't. They followed the tracks for 3 miles before losing them at a frozen river. But here's what they didn't include in their official report, what they only whispered about later, when they were old men trying to make sense of what they'd seen. They found a message carved into a tree. The letters were rough, like they'd been gouged with claws, but readable. 5 words. Still hungry, always hungry, help. No one knew what to make of it. Was it a warning, a plea, a threat? But the researchers understood one thing. Whatever made those tracks, whatever carved that message, part of it still remembered being human. And that might be the most horrifying thing of all. So here we are at the end of this story, or perhaps at the beginning of understanding. The Wendigo isn't a monster you meet in the woods. It's a transformation that happens inside, a slow erosion of the things that make us human, replaced by hunger that can never be satisfied. It starts with a choice, always a choice, that moment when you prioritize your own survival over your own humanity. When you cross a line, you can never uncross. For Thomas, it was eating that doe alive. For others, it might be something else entirely, betraying a friend to save yourself, sacrificing your principles for advancement, choosing comfort over conscience again and again, until you can't remember what conscience felt like. The curse doesn't care how you get there. It only cares that you cross the threshold. And once you do, the hunger begins. Maybe it's hunger for food. Maybe it's hunger for power, for validation, for control, for connection. The type doesn't matter. What matters is that it becomes all-consuming, that it replaces everything else you are. Third, that it never ever stops. Here's what haunts me about this story. What should haunt you too. Where's the line? At what point does normal ambition become destructive hunger? When does healthy self-interest become pathological selfishness? How many small compromises does it take before you've compromised yourself completely? Thomas Whitmore thought he was strong, thought he was in control, thought he could handle anything the wilderness threw at him. He was wrong. And the terrifying thing is, we all think we're different. We all believe we'd recognize the warning signs, that we'd turn back before crossing that final threshold. But the hunger is subtle. It grows slowly, and by the time you realize what's happening, you're already too far gone to stop. So let me ask you something, and think carefully before you answer. That gnawing feeling in your chest, that sense that nothing you achieve is ever quite enough, that hunger for something you can't quite name, that keeps you scrolling, searching, consuming, always looking for the next thing to fill the void. How long have you been feeling that? And more importantly, is it getting worse? The northern wilderness still holds its secrets, remote places where cell phones don't work and GPS signals fade, where winter brings darkness that lasts for months, where a person could vanish and never be found. And in those places, the old ones still wander. Creatures that were once human, that remember in some fragmented way what it felt like to have a name, to have loved ones, to have purposes beyond the endless hunt. Most people who encounter them don't survive to tell the tale, but sometimes someone escapes, stumbles back to civilization with stories of creatures in the dark, of beings that move impossibly fast, of hunger given form. We call them crazy. We dismiss their stories. We explain away the evidence. For we seem here, and because the alternative is too terrifying to accept, that the Wendigo is real, that the transformation is possible, that under the right conditions any of us could become one, that the hunger is waiting, always waiting, for that moment of weakness, that desperate choice, that line we swear we'll never cross. Hurt us until we do. Thomas Whitmore is still out there, probably. The thing that used to be him anyway, still wandering, still hunting, still trapped in an existence that can't end and can't be endured. Sometimes hikers in northern Canada report strange occurrences, tracks that appear overnight, supplies that vanish from locked cabins, the sense of being watched by something vast and ancient and impossibly patient. Most dismiss it as wildlife, bears, wolves, natural phenomena. But some feel it for what it really is. Hunger, endless, eternal waiting. So tell me, what part disturbs you most, the physical transformation into something monstrous, or the knowledge that your consciousness would remain trapped, aware, forever hungry? Because honestly, I can't decide which is worse. And that choice, that inability to choose, maybe that's the first symptom. Leave a comment if you dare. Tell me which horror would claim you first. And remember, the hunger is always listening, always waiting, always ready to welcome one more into the endless cold. But the Wendigo isn't the only thing that wears human skin. There's another creature, another transformation, one that the indigenous peoples of the Southwest speak about in whispers, one that makes the Wendigo look almost merciful. The Skinwalker. And the truth about what they really are, what they can really do, it's been hidden for a reason. So click the video on your screen right now, the forbidden truth about skinwalkers. I'll see you in a few seconds in the next creepy file.